This morning's worship service is inspired by an article that I recently read about Nelson Mandela. Now, he's a guy that's been studied in just about every way imaginable. Now, this particular article talked about his sense of emotional discipline. He wasn't a super passive or calm guy by nature. He was deeply passionate about human equality and for the future of his country. What set him apart, though, was his ability to harness those raw emotions into a powerful force for change. Some of us saw a bit of this vision of Nelson Mandela in the 2009 film Invictus. It was huge. I imagine some of you saw it. The film tells the story of the South African rugby team and how Nelson Mandela publicly supported them just after the end of apartheid. Now, rugby is a pretty white sport. It has been, and I think it still is. Back in 1995, shortly after the end of 50 years of apartheid, black South Africans had a strong distaste, let's say, for the national rugby team, the Springboks. It was a team playing a white sport by white players claiming to represent South Africa. Noticing this symbolic division, Nelson Mandela saw an opportunity. Not a huge sports enthusiast himself, he went out of his way to urge black South Africans to support their rugby team. And that year, against all odds, South Africa made it into the final match of the World Cup against New Zealand. And Mandela went to the match and astonished the players of the Springboks by appearing in their locker room just before the game, wearing the jersey of the team captain, number 6, and wishing them good luck. In a huge upset, they won the match 15-12, and when President Mandela walked onto the field to present the trophy, still wearing this jersey of the Springboks, the largely white Afrikaner crowd broke into chant, "Nelson, Nelson, Nelson." It seems a little bit like a squishy moment made for Hollywood. It was actually a lot more impactful, though. That moment had a devastating effect on the far-right white groups. The people who had rejected the post-apartheid government and refused to recognize the new constitution. Those white, far-right groups mostly disintegrated. They stopped using the old symbols, the old flag, the old songs, and Nelson Mandela became the symbol of a whole country. Symbols matter in politics of any society. And Mandela was a master of symbols. Obviously, he did more than wear a rugby jersey. That moment, though, is chosen as emblematic of his brilliant strategic leadership. Even more than in Mandela's time, we live in a political landscape of symbols. On social media, memes, these single images with just a few words try to express a complicated idea. With a new level of vitriol in American politics, an entire market of political novelty gifts has emerged. The one that I've seen the most often advertised is the toilet brush in the shape of Donald Trump. You've probably seen this. The bristles of the brush are Trump's hair. It's difficult to imagine a few years ago that we would widely accept a toilet brush shaped like a sitting American president. I want to draw an important distinction here. Political cartoons are a long-established, powerful form of critique. They lift up a political idea or a policy that a leader has made and poke fun at it. They're about policies and ideas, not about hating a particular person. So last year, around Christmas time, I was shopping for some canine friends, and I stumbled upon dog toys with a similar theme. And this politically astute store in Lake Forest sold both toys of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. They're little stuffed dolls with particularly unflattering faces and wild hair. Now, to get the full effect of these toys, you have to understand my dog, Lucy. When it comes to stuffed toys, she is not a cuddler. She's a destroyer. My otherwise sweet girl will gut stuffed toys in a matter of seconds. It's a wild, vicious scene. I'm ashamed to admit, but I think it's important to tell you, I purchased one of these toys. I thought it was funny at the time. A few days later, I threw the toy away before I gave it to a dog, but I was very, very close. Being sensitive to the symbols that we use is part of recognizing the effect that it has on others. I imagine Donald Trump is pretty annoyed at a toilet brush version of himself. I'm equally concerned, though, about the impact these images have on ourselves, the consumers. Dehumanizing our adversary is dangerous stuff. We know it was a tool of propaganda when Nazis depicted Jewish people as rats, or in Rwanda when Hutus called Tutsis cockroaches, leading up to their attempted extermination of their neighbors. This isn't a legacy that we want to be part of. I know we aren't anywhere near violent political conflict in the United States. Neither party is about to attempt to exterminate the other, but we have crept closer and closer to seeing our adversaries as monsters. In the article I read about Mandela, he was asked to comment on the war in Yugoslavia and the genocide that took place in Europe just after South Africa managed to peacefully navigate the end of apartheid. Mandela first said, "I would be presumptuous to lecture Bosnian leaders." Then he added, "They thought through their blood and not their brains. In countries where innocent people are dying, the leaders are following their blood rather than their brains." Nelson Mandela is known for many things: his commitment to nonviolence and his ability to lay the groundwork for South Africa's future, and surviving 27 years of prison without succumbing to bitterness. In some ways, he appears to be a saint, but the author of this article argued that if he was saintly for a purpose. It may be true that he was just a good guy with a pure heart. What's just as likely, though, is that Mandela cultivated his emotional discipline with his eye on a particular goal. There was a pragmatism to his nonviolent style. From the perspective of privilege, from the perspective that most of us sit at Tapestry, it's not easy to see that sometimes peace is the only pragmatic choice that you have. For the past few weeks, several Tapestry members and I have been in pretty deep conversations about racial justice. Our conversation partners are members of the Second Baptist Church in Santa Ana. It's a historically black church. And the conversation is very highly structured. We sit in a circle of probably 15 people, and we discuss one question at a time. Now that we've spent 6 hours together, the conversations are getting pretty deep. At our last meeting, one of the questions was, what are some of the things that trigger you around race? And the white participants in this circle were slow as we struggled to come up with an answer. The people of color, on the other hand, had multiple immediate examples of how they had personally been slighted. One after another, they told short examples of how white people had, in subtle and not so subtle ways, demeaned them. It was jarring to hear. Not so much the content. I was familiar with most of these types of comments and the way they came about. What was jarring was the sheer number of them and the speed at which they were recounted by every person of color in that circle. They named multiple encounters with racism. Now, the next question in this conversation was sort of a summary of the day. We were asked to summarize what we had learned and how we were feeling about the conversation. And that response caught me off guard just as much. Several people in the circle mentioned that they were reminded of the necessity of keeping an open heart, to take a breath, and to not overreact to racist comments. When it got to my turn, I naively said that they had every right to be frustrated, even angry. I said that they didn't need to be more patient or understanding, that it was okay to be upset, and they didn't owe those people anything. I now realize how incredibly naive that was. I now realize that my sense of having lots of options of how to respond comes from my place of privilege. I failed to realize that responding in anger very likely could have meant alienating a neighbor or losing a job or possibly being physically harmed. In my world, for the most part, when I'm slighted, I have options of how to respond without too much concern about what might happen to me. For the people around the circle who had been insulted by coworkers, neighbors, teachers, police, reacting in anger, I now realize, isn't really a viable option. A nonviolent, measured reaction is as much about pragmatism as it is about being good. We cannot afford to think with our blood. We must think with our brains. This conundrum of how to respond when slighted is somewhat new for white liberals, I think. For most of us, most of our lives, we've had options of how to respond. We can raise our voices or call the police. We can stay silent and be invisible because it's not our visible identity that's part of the conversation. There have been options. But I get the sense in this moment of heightened political anxiety that for the first time, white liberals are starting to feel like our options are also limited. If we speak our mind to the police, there might be repercussions. If we defend our views at work vocally, our jobs could be endangered. It's time to take a note from folks who have been navigating the minefield of responding to hostility their entire lives. It's time to learn that sometimes nonviolence and reconciliation is the pragmatic choice. I'm not talking about meekness or silence. I'm talking about strategic engagement, picking our battles and thinking with our brains rather than our blood. Part of nonviolence, of course, is monitoring our behavior. But it's difficult to consistently moderate your behavior when it conflicts with your emotional state. Anyone who has tried to change an addiction or a habit can attest to that. Changing the outside is really hard if you haven't changed the inside first. Eventually, reliable nonviolence has to come not just from peaceful action and speech, it has to come from actual mental and emotional grounding. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about 4 different paths of peace. The second path, or paths of truth, rather. The second path was about ethics and a belief system that gives us a foundation. And in our search for a foundation of peace, we're summoning that second path of truth. We're digging to find a solid foundation to rest on. And it looks different for different people. For me, it looks mostly like mindfulness. That's sort of a modern interpretation of meditation. The goal is to calm your mind and to be present in the moment. For some people, that foundation might look like resting in the presence of God. For other people, it might be resting in the interdependent web of life, or the feeling of loving community, or surrendering your sense of control and letting a higher power guide the way. Grounding in peace comes through several different forms and traditions. But what I really want to get at is that it's not an idea, it's a feeling. It's not an action, it's a way of being. So I was still writing this sermon Friday afternoon as the news broke that Robert Mueller had released the results of his investigation to the Attorney General. My sense is that the political chaos, the meanness, the name-calling, and the dehumanization is probably only ramping up. And unless we choose a different path, unless we dig deep to find some personal grounding of peace, we too will be swept up in that mix. Now, I don't have that grounding all the time. I don't have the weight of a Mandela or a Dr. King or those thousands of children that marched with him in Montgomery. But I'm learning that nonviolence is the pragmatic choice. And I'm hoping that we can help each other to choose nonviolence when we can. Amen.